The torches cast dancing shadows across the stone walls of the grand hall as Jane stood before the assembled vampire court, her wrists bound in silver chains that burned her skin with every breath. 300 immortals watched from the gallery, their eyes gleaming with predatory interest as Lord Darius stood beside the vampire king's throne, his handsome face twisted with disgust as he pointed an accusing finger at the trembling woman who had once believed herself to be his fated mate. "This human dared to claim a blood bond with me," Darius announced, his voice carrying through the cavernous chamber with theatrical precision. "She manipulated her way into our sacred gathering, posed as my intended mate, and deceived every noble vampire in this kingdom. The punishment for such blasphemy is death at dawn." Jane's legs threatened to buckle beneath her, but she forced herself to remain standing even as the silver burned deeper into her flesh. The pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing through her chest as she stared at the man she had trusted with every secret, every vulnerability, every desperate hope that she might belong somewhere in this dark and beautiful world. 3 months ago, Darius had whispered promises against her throat as they lay tangled together in his chambers. He had traced the strange mark on her collarbone and told her it meant she was destined to be his. He had made her believe that her humanity didn't matter, that love could bridge the impossible distance between mortal and immortal. He had lied about everything. "I never claimed to be anything but what I am," Jane said, her voice shaking but audible enough to reach the front rows of the gallery. "You told me the mark meant we were fated mates. You brought me to the solstice celebration. You introduced me as your blood bonded." Darius's eyes flashed red with rage. "Lies. Pathetic human lies designed to elevate your worthless existence above your station." A woman's laugh rang out from the gallery, sharp and cruel as breaking glass. Lady Vivian descended the steps with predatory grace, her crimson gown flowing behind her like spilled blood. She had been Darius's lover before Jane appeared, and the hatred in her eyes promised suffering beyond imagination. "The little human thought she could steal a vampire lord from his own kind," Vivian purred, circling Jane like a cat toying with wounded prey. How delicious, how utterly pathetic. Jane's gaze swept the assembled court, searching desperately for a single face that might show mercy or even doubt. But the vampire stared back with expressions ranging from bored amusement to open contempt. To them, she was nothing, less than nothing, a mortal who had somehow stumbled into their world and dared to reach for something so far above her station that the very attempt was laughable. Only one figure remained utterly still among the restless crowd. The vampire king sat upon his obsidian throne at the head of the chamber, his features cast in shadow despite the blazing torches. Abraham. The name itself was legend, whispered in terrified reverence throughout the vampire kingdom. Ancient beyond measure, powerful beyond comprehension, and brutal to anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. He had ruled for over 2,000 years, and in all that time, no one had ever seen him show mercy to a human. Jane had never been formally presented to the king, despite attending the solstice celebration. Darius had kept her close to his side throughout the evening, introducing her to lesser nobles, but carefully steering her away from the throne. Now she understood why. He had never intended for her to survive long enough to meet the one vampire who might recognize the truth of what she was. "Your Majesty," Darius said, bowing low toward the throne, "I request permission to execute this deceiver myself at dawn. Let her death serve as warning to any other humans who might harbor delusions of equality with our kind." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush bones. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs as the shadowed figure on the throne finally moved, leaning forward just enough that torchlight caught the sharp angles of his face. Abraham was devastatingly beautiful in the way of predators, all dangerous elegance and barely contained violence. His eyes were the color of old silver, metallic and cold, as they fixed on Jane with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Remove her chains," the king said, his voice quiet but absolute. The command hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Darius's confident smirk faltered. "Your Majesty?" "I don't recall stuttering, Lord Darius." Abraham's tone remained conversational, but something deadly lurked beneath the surface. "Remove her chains. Now." A guard rushed forward to unlock the silver restraints, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the key. The moment the metal fell away, Jane collapsed to her knees, her wrists raw and blistered where the silver had burned through skin down to muscle. She cradled her damaged hands against her chest, fighting back tears of pain and humiliation as the entire court watched her weakness on display. Abraham rose from his throne with the fluid grace of smoke rising. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing through the chamber like a death knell. The assembled vampires shrank back instinctively, creating a clear path between the king and the kneeling human. When he reached Jane, he crouched down until they were eye level, studying her face with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Show me your collarbone," he commanded softly. Jane's hands trembled as she pulled aside the torn fabric of her dress, revealing the mark that had started all of this. It looked like a brand, silver and intricate, depicting a phoenix rising from flames with wings spread wide. Darius had told her it appeared the first time they kissed, proof of their fated bond. She had believed him so completely that she never questioned why a mating mark would show a phoenix instead of the traditional intertwined symbols. Abraham's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign of surprise he allowed himself. He reached out and traced the mark with one finger, and the moment his skin made contact, the phoenix began to glow. Brilliant white light poured from Jane's collarbone, so bright that vampires throughout the chamber cried out and shielded their eyes. The light intensified until Jane felt it burning through her veins like liquid fire, setting every nerve ending ablaze with sensation that transcended pain into something primal and transformative. When the light finally faded, Jane gasped for air and found Abraham staring at her with an expression of wonder she never imagined a creature like him could wear. "Impossible," he whispered. "The Daywalker bloodline ended 900 years ago. I watched the last of them burn at dawn after the Great Purge." "What?" Jane managed through the lingering burn in her chest. "I don't understand." Abraham straightened to his full height, his gaze sweeping the assembled court with renewed authority. "This woman carries the blood of the Ancient Ones. The Phoenix mark is not a mating bond. It is the seal of the Daywalker line, placed upon the firstborn of each generation by the original council to identify those who carry the gift." Chaos erupted in the gallery. Vampires surged to their feet, shouting questions and accusations in a dozen languages. Lady Vivian's face had gone pale as death, her crimson lips parted in shock. But it was Darius whose reaction sent ice down Jane's spine. The vampire lord stood frozen in place, all color draining from his aristocratic features as the full weight of his mistake became apparent. "Silence!" Abraham didn't raise his voice, but power rolled through the chamber like thunder. Every vampire in the room fell quiet immediately, their survival instincts overriding curiosity. Lord Darius, you have made a grave error. You found a Daywalker descendant and mistook her bloodline mark for a mating bond. Then, rather than admit your ignorance, you chose to accuse her of deception and demand her execution. Your Majesty, I didn't know, Darius began, but Abraham silenced him with a gesture. That is precisely the problem. You didn't know because you are too young and too arrogant to recognize power beyond your comprehension. The king turned back to Jane, and something in his silver eyes made her breath catch. The Daywalker bloodline was hunted to extinction because vampires feared what they represented. Immortals who could walk in sunlight, who possessed strength that rivaled the oldest vampires despite mortal lifespans, who could drink vampire blood and transform without dying. The ancient council declared them too dangerous to exist. Jane's mind reeled. But I'm just human. I can't do any of those things. Because your power is dormant, Abraham explained. The phoenix mark appears when a Daywalker descendant reaches maturity, but the gifts only manifest after awakening, which requires drinking the blood of an ancient vampire willingly given. The implications crashed over Jane like a tidal wave. Darius had sensed her potential without understanding what it meant. He had recognized that she was different, special, powerful in some undefined way, and his vampire instincts had responded to that power. But he had been too ignorant or too prideful to investigate further, to question why a human girl would carry a mark he had never encountered before. The penalty for attempting to execute a Daywalker descendant is severe, Abraham continued, his gaze fixed on Darius with the cold precision of a surgeon selecting where to make the first cut. Even one who hasn't yet awakened. You will be stripped of your title and lands. You will serve in the blood mines for 100 years, and you will watch as I claim what you were too foolish to recognize. Darius fell to his knees. Your Majesty, please. I beg for mercy. I didn't know what she was. And that ignorance nearly cost this kingdom something irreplaceable. Abraham turned his back on the groveling vampire lord, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he had ceased to exist. He extended a hand to Jane, palm up in clear invitation. Come. We have much to discuss, and you need medical attention for those burns. Jane stared at the offered hand, her mind struggling to process everything that had happened in the last 10 minutes. She had come to the grand hall expecting to die at dawn. Now the most powerful vampire in existence was offering to help her stand, speaking of claiming her, treating her like something precious instead of disposable. It felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare wearing the disguise of salvation. But what choice did she have? She placed her burned hand in Abraham's, and he closed his fingers around hers with surprising gentleness. The moment their skin touched, that strange fire ignited again in her collarbone, sending warmth cascading through her body like summer sunlight. Abraham's eyes flashed brighter silver, and Jane realized with a jolt that he felt it too. Your Majesty! Lady Vivian called from the gallery, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Surely you cannot mean to claim a human girl based solely on an ancient mark. There must be proof of her bloodline before such drastic action. Abraham's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the chamber dropped 10 degrees. Are you questioning my judgment, Lady Vivian? The female vampire's confidence wavered. Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely suggest that testing would be prudent before making permanent decisions. Then test her, Abraham said simply. But know this, if her bloodline proves true, as I know it will, the penalty for your doubt will be considerable. Jane wanted to protest, to demand answers about what kind of testing they intended, but Abraham's hand tightened fractionally around hers in what might have been warning or reassurance. He led her from the grand hall with every eye in the chamber following their linked hands, through corridors of carved stone and past tapestries depicting ancient battles between vampires and humans. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to ascend forever, finally emerging in a circular chamber at the top of the highest tower. The room was stark and beautiful, furnished only with a massive bed draped in black silk, a desk covered in ancient scrolls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the vampire kingdom stretching into darkness. Abraham released Jane's hand and moved to a cabinet carved from dark wood, retrieving supplies for her burns with efficient movements that suggested he had tended wounds before. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the bed. Jane perched on the edge, hyper-aware of the intimacy of the situation. A vampire king tending to her injuries in his private chambers felt surreal, dangerous, and oddly tender all at once. Abraham knelt before her, which seemed wrong on so many levels, and began treating her burned wrists with salve that immediately eased the pain. "Why are you helping me?" Jane whispered. "You don't know me." "I know what you are," Abraham replied, his focus on wrapping clean bandages around her wrists. "And I know what it means to be the last of your kind, the loneliness of it, the weight of carrying something precious that the world wants destroyed." "I'm not the last," Jane pointed out. "I didn't even know this bloodline existed until tonight." "But you are the last who carries the mark, the last with the potential to awaken." Abraham finished securing the bandage and sat back on his heels, finally meeting her gaze. "Your grandmother knew, I suspect. She must have hidden you very carefully to have kept you alive this long." Jane's throat tightened. Her grandmother had died 5 years ago, taking countless secrets to the grave. The old woman had always been strange, protective to the point of paranoia, adamant that Jane never tell anyone about the mark on her collarbone. "She said it was a birthmark. She made me promise to keep it covered always." "She saved your life." Abraham stood and moved to the windows, staring out at his kingdom with hands clasped behind his back. "The vampires who hunted the Daywalker bloodline are all dead now, killed by time or warfare or my own hand. But the fear remains. Many in my court would prefer you destroyed rather than awakened." "Then why tell them what I am?" Jane demanded, frustration and fear making her brave. "You could have let Darius execute me and no one would have questioned it." Abraham turned from the window, and the intensity in his silver eyes stole her breath. "Because you are mine." The words hung between them, absolute and possessive. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. "You don't own me." "Not ownership," Abraham corrected, moving closer with predatory grace. "Recognition. The moment I saw your mark, I knew. The moment I touched you and felt the power sleeping in your blood, I knew. You are what I have been searching for across centuries. The answer to a question I stopped asking because I believed the answer was extinct." "What question?" "How to save my people from our own weakness." Abraham stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his body. "Vampires are dying. Our birth rate has dropped to nearly nothing. Those who are turned often don't survive the transformation. We are an immortal race, marching slowly toward extinction because we have bred ourselves into fragility." Jane's mind raced. And the Daywalker bloodline? Represented strength, hybrid vigor, the ability to survive transformation without fail, to walk in daylight without burning, to produce offspring with both humans and vampires successfully. Abraham reached out and traced the phoenix mark again, and that fire ignited in Jane's veins. If I awaken you, if you survive and thrive as I believe you will, you become the foundation for a new future, a bridge between what we were and what we might become. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone who was kneeling in chains 20 minutes ago, Jane said weakly. Abraham's lips curved in what might have been amusement. I am not known for my patience or my subtlety, but I am giving you a choice, which is more than you would have received elsewhere. I can awaken your bloodline by offering my blood freely given. If you survive the transformation, and Daywalkers always did historically, you will become something unprecedented. The first of your kind in 9 centuries, powerful enough that no vampire would dare threaten you, including Darius and his scorned lover. Jane's hands trembled as she processed the offer. And if I refuse? Then I will protect you to the best of my ability, but I cannot guarantee your safety. Lady Vivian is not the only vampire in this court who fears what you represent. There will be attempts on your life. Many attempts. Abraham's expression darkened. And eventually, one will succeed. It was, Jane realized, not really a choice at all. Death by assassination or transformation into something powerful enough to survive. Those were her options. But beneath the pragmatic calculation, something else stirred in her chest. Curiosity, wonder, the strange rightness of Abraham's touch, and the way her mark responded to his presence as if recognizing something her conscious mind had not yet grasped. If I do this, Jane said slowly, if I drink your blood and awaken, what happens then? Abraham's silver eyes gleamed. Then you become my queen, my blood-bonded mate, the mother of a new vampire dynasty that will reshape our world. That's insane, Jane breathed. You don't even know me. I know you stood before my entire court with silver burning your flesh and refused to beg. I know you looked Darius in the eye and called him a liar, even when you believed you would die for it. I know your blood calls to mine in a way I have not felt in 2,000 years. Abraham cupped her face with both hands, his touch impossibly gentle for a creature capable of tearing her apart. I know enough. Jane should have been terrified, should have recognized the danger of accepting such an offer from a vampire king who admitted he was neither patient nor subtle. But the alternative was dying slowly, hunted through corridors and chambers until someone's blade found her heart. At least this way, she chose her own transformation. She seized her own power. All right, Jane whispered. Awaken me. Abraham's expression shifted into something predatory and reverent all at once. He guided her to lie back on the bed, arranging her carefully as if she were something precious. Then he bit his own wrist, tearing the flesh with his fangs until dark blood welled up and spilled over pale skin. He held his wrist above her mouth, and Jane realized she was supposed to drink. She had never tasted blood before, never imagined she would. But she parted her lips and let Abraham's blood flow into her mouth, and the instant it touched her tongue, the world exploded. Power slammed through her body like lightning striking bone. Her back arched off the bed as every cell ignited simultaneously, burning and rebuilding and transforming. The phoenix mark on her collarbone blazed so brightly it illuminated the entire chamber, casting dancing shadows across the ceiling. Jane tried to scream but could produce no sound, her voice lost in the overwhelming sensation of her humanity shattering and reforming into something infinitely stronger. Abraham held her through the transformation, one hand braced behind her head and the other pressing his bleeding wrist to her lips. "Drink," he commanded. "Don't stop. Your body needs more." Jane obeyed, pulling blood from his vein with desperate hunger. It tasted like darkness and starlight and ancient stone, like every forbidden thing she had ever craved. Her burned wrists healed as she watched, skin knitting together until no trace of injury remained. Her senses exploded outward. She could hear conversations in the floors below, smell the fear radiating from guards stationed throughout the castle, feel the texture of every thread in the silk sheets beneath her body. And she could feel Abraham. Not just his physical presence, but his emotions, his power, his absolute certainty that she would survive this transformation. Their blood sang to each other, vampire and daywalker, ancient and awakening, creating a harmony neither had known they were missing. When Jane finally released his wrist, gasping for air she no longer needed, her entire world had shifted. Colors were more vivid, sounds more distinct, every sensation amplified beyond mortal comprehension. She sat up slowly, marveling at the strength coursing through her limbs, and met Abraham's gaze with eyes that now matched his silver shade. "How do you feel?" Abraham asked, his voice rough. "Alive," Jane breathed. "For the first time in my life. Actually, alive." Abraham's smile was small but genuine. "Good. Now we test whether the legends about daywalkers were true." He pulled back the heavy curtains covering the windows, and Jane's heart stopped. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains, sending shafts of golden light spilling into the chamber. Every vampire instinct she had inherited screamed at her to flee the sunlight, to hide in darkness where her kind belonged. But Abraham stood directly in the path of the light, extending his hand in invitation. "Trust me," he said simply. Jane took his hand and stepped into the sunlight. Nothing happened. No burning, no pain, no flesh crumbling to ash. The morning light washed over her skin like warm water, and Jane laughed with pure joy. She was standing in direct sunlight for the first time since her transformation, something no vampire had done in recorded history, and it felt glorious. "The first daywalker in 900 years, Abraham murmured, watching her with an expression that might have been hope. "You are magnificent." Jane turned to him, suddenly aware that he remained carefully in shadow while she stood bathed in light. "Can you?" "No. That gift is yours alone. Old vampires like me burn faster than the young ones." But Abraham didn't look envious or resentful. He looked proud, as if her achievement somehow reflected well on him. "But our children will inherit your gift. They will walk in daylight and rule the night. They will be unstoppable." The mention of children should have seemed premature, absurd, but Jane found she didn't mind. Everything had changed so completely in the last hour that planning for a future she never thought she would have felt almost reasonable. "The court won't accept this, Lady Vivian especially." The court will accept what I tell them to accept, Abraham said with absolute confidence. But you are correct that there will be challenges. Vivienne has wanted my throne for centuries. She will see your presence as both threat and opportunity. Then we should prepare, Jane said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She had gone from terrified captive to awakened daywalker in less than 2 hours. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt focused, clear, ready. What do I need to know? Abraham's smile widened into something fierce. Everything. They spent the day in Abraham's chambers as he taught Jane the basics of vampire politics and power. She learned that the court operated on a complex hierarchy of ancient bloodlines and political alliances, that challenges for territory and status were common and often deadly, that mercy was seen as weakness unless wielded with perfect precision. She learned that Abraham had ruled for so long not because he was the strongest, though he was, but because he was the most strategic, the most ruthless, the most willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain order. Lady Vivienne will challenge you directly, Abraham explained as the sun began its descent toward evening. Probably within the next few days. She cannot challenge me without cause, but she can question your worthiness to stand beside me. Be prepared. What kind of challenge? Jane asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Combat. To first blood if she is feeling generous, to true death if she is not. Abraham caught Jane's expression, and his voice softened fractionally. You are Daywalker now, stronger than any newly turned vampire has right to be. You can survive her. I've never fought anyone in my life, Jane pointed out. I was a library assistant 3 months ago. Then we practice. Abraham rose and offered his hand. Now. They moved to a training room deep beneath the castle, a circular chamber with walls scarred by centuries of combat. Abraham armed Jane with a blade and spent hours teaching her the basics of vampire fighting, how to move faster than human eyes could follow, how to sense an opponent's intentions through changes in blood flow and breathing, how to use her new strength without losing control. She was clumsy at first, her movements uncoordinated as her enhanced abilities outpaced her instincts. But Abraham was patient in a way she hadn't expected, correcting her stance and adjusting her grip until muscle memory began to form. You learn quickly, Abraham observed as Jane finally managed to block one of his attacks. Your bloodline gives you advantages beyond strength. Like what? Jane panted, sweat dampening her skin despite the cool air. Instinct. Daywalkers were legendary warriors because they could anticipate their opponent's moves. You are reading my intentions before I act on them. Abraham circled her slowly, and Jane felt the predatory focus radiating from him. Now, attack me as if you mean to kill. Jane hesitated for only a moment before lunging forward, blade aimed at Abraham's throat. He deflected easily, but his smile suggested approval. They sparred for hours more, until Jane's new body finally acknowledged exhaustion and demanded rest. Abraham escorted her back to his chambers, her chambers now, apparently, and helped her wash away the sweat and blood from training. Tomorrow night, we present you to the court officially, Abraham said as Jane dried her hair by the fire. I will announce our blood bond and your new status as queen. There will be protests. Vivienne will be at the center of them. And then she challenges me, Jane finished. And then you defeat her, Abraham corrected. You strip her of her pride and position and send a clear message to every vampire in this kingdom that you are not to be trifled with. Jane met his gaze across the flickering firelight. You really believe I can do this? I know you can. Abraham crossed to where she sat and tilted her chin up with gentle fingers. You are Daywalker. You are mine. And you are stronger than you realize. He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if giving her time to refuse. But Jane leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to fist in his shirt as she pulled him closer. The blood bond between them hummed with connection, turning the kiss into something that transcended mere physical attraction. It felt like recognition, like two puzzle pieces finally slotting into place after searching across centuries. When they finally broke apart, both breathless despite not needing air, Abraham rested his forehead against hers. Sleep, he murmured. Tomorrow changes everything. Jane slept fitfully, her dreams full of fire and blood and silver eyes. When she woke, Abraham was already dressed in formal attire, black silk and crimson accents that marked him as king. He helped Jane into a gown of midnight blue that left her shoulders bare, ensuring the phoenix mark was visible to everyone who looked. They descended to the grand hall together as the sun set, their fingers intertwined. The assembled court fell silent as they entered. 300 vampires watched as Abraham led Jane to the raised platform where his throne stood. Darius was noticeably absent, already condemned to the blood mines. But Lady Vivienne stood in the front row, her crimson gown replaced by one of pure white, the traditional color of challenge among vampire nobility. Abraham's voice carried through the chamber with absolute authority. I present to you Jane, awakened Daywalker and rightful heir to the ancient bloodline we foolishly destroyed. She has bonded to my blood and will stand beside me as queen of this realm. The silence that followed vibrated with tension. Then Vivienne stepped forward, her voice sweet as poison. Your Majesty, while I do not question your judgment, surely the court deserves proof of her bloodline and worthiness. The ancient texts spoke of trials the Daywalkers underwent to prove their power. I merely suggest we honor tradition. You suggest, Abraham said mildly, that my blood-bonded mate should prove herself to you. To the court, Vivienne corrected, for the good of the kingdom. Abraham looked at Jane, and she saw the question in his silver eyes. She could refuse. He would support her decision and damn the political consequences. But Jane had learned something about herself in the last day. She was tired of being underestimated, dismissed, treated as less than she was. She wanted to prove her worth, not for Vivienne or the court, but for herself. I accept the challenge, Jane announced clearly. Name your terms. Vivienne's smile was sharp as broken glass. Trial by combat. To true death. Gasps rippled through the assembly. True death meant no mercy, no yield, no surrender. One of them would die in the next hour. Abraham's hand tightened on Jane's shoulder, but she shook her head fractionally. This was her fight, her choice. Accepted, Jane said, and the word rang like a bell through the chamber. The court relocated to the combat arena beneath the castle. A massive, circular space ringed with stadium seating where vampires had settled disputes for millennia. Jane stood in the center of the arena, blade in hand, while Vivienne circled her like a stalking cat. The older vampire had centuries of experience, countless victories carved into her legend. Jane had less than 2 days of training. But she also had something Vivienne didn't. The desperate fury of someone who had been dismissed and degraded and nearly executed for crimes she didn't commit. That rage burned clean and bright in her chest as Vivienne lunged. The first exchange happened almost too fast for the watching vampires to follow. Vivienne struck with lethal precision, her blade aimed at Jane's heart. But Jane's Daywalker instincts kicked in, letting her sense the attack before it landed. She twisted aside and countered with a slash that opened a shallow cut along Vivian's ribs. First blood to the challenger. Vivian's expression shifted from confidence to fury. She attacked again, faster and more viciously, forcing Jane back across the arena floor. Jane defended desperately, her newly acquired skills barely sufficient to keep Vivian's blade from finding her throat. She could feel Abraham's presence in the stands, his absolute faith in her survival, and it steadied her. But Vivian was good. Better than good. She feinted left and struck right, her blade slicing deep across Jane's shoulder. Pain exploded through Jane's body, but it was distant, manageable. Her Daywalker blood began healing the wound immediately, flesh knitting back together even as she pivoted and drove her own blade toward Vivian's heart. Vivian blocked, but Jane felt the impact shudder through the older vampire's arm. She was stronger. The realization hit like lightning. She was physically stronger than a vampire who had lived for centuries. The Daywalker bloodline made her superior in raw power, and Vivian knew it. Fear flickered across Vivian's perfect features, and Jane pressed her advantage. She attacked with renewed confidence, driving Vivian back step by step across the arena. Their blades met again and again, the ringing of steel echoing off stone walls. Jane opened cuts on Vivian's arms, her legs, her face, each wound shallow but degrading. She was dismantling her opponent piece by piece, stripping away the arrogance and pride until only desperation remained. "You are nothing," Vivian hissed, desperation making her reckless. "A human, pretending to be something greater. When I kill you, Abraham will forget you ever existed." "Then kill me," Jane challenged, "or admit defeat." Vivian screamed and lunged with everything she had, her blade aimed straight at Jane's heart with the full force of her ancient strength behind it. It was a killing blow, perfectly executed, backed by centuries of combat experience. Jane sidestepped, caught Vivian's wrist, and twisted hard enough to shatter bone. The blade clattered to the arena floor. Then Jane drove her own blade through Vivian's chest, piercing the heart with surgical precision. The older vampire's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as her body began to crumble. "Abraham won't forget me," Jane whispered into Vivian's ear. "Because I am stronger than you ever were." Vivian collapsed into ash and dust, her white gown the last thing to disintegrate. Jane stood alone in the center of the arena, breathing hard, covered in blood both her own and her opponent's. The assembled court sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, Abraham rose from his seat. He descended to the arena floor and crossed to where Jane stood. "The challenge is satisfied," Abraham announced, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. "Jane has proven her worth beyond question. Any who doubt her place beside me may leave this court now and never return." No one moved. No one spoke. The message was clear. Jane was untouchable, powerful, protected by the king himself and her own formidable abilities. She had gone from condemned human to vampire queen in less than 48 hours, and anyone foolish enough to challenge her would meet the same fate as Vivian. Abraham took Jane's face in both hands, tilting her head up so their eyes met. "You were magnificent," he said softly, then claimed her mouth in a kiss that left no doubt who she belonged to. The court erupted in cheers and applause, the sound washing over Jane like a tidal wave of acceptance. That night, Abraham held a formal blood bonding ceremony in the grand hall. Jane knelt before the assembled court, while Abraham recited ancient vows in a language dead for millennia. He cut his palm in hers, pressing their bleeding hands together as vampire magic wove their lives into a single, unbreakable strand. The phoenix mark on Jane's collarbone blazed brilliantly, and an answering mark appeared on Abraham's chest, proof of their eternal bond visible to anyone who looked. "From this night forward," Abraham declared, "Jane is my blood-bonded queen, my eternal mate, the mother of the new vampire dynasty. Her word is my word, her will is my will, and anyone who threatens her will answer to me." The court knelt as one, hundreds of vampires bowing before their new queen. Jane felt the weight of their respect, their fear, their cautious acceptance. She had earned this position through combat and survival, through proving she was stronger than anyone expected. Abraham led her from the grand hall to the balcony overlooking the kingdom. Dawn was still hours away, but Jane could already feel the promise of sunlight on her skin. She leaned into Abraham's embrace, his cold body pressed against her back, and looked out at the dark landscape that was now her domain. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now we rebuild," Abraham replied. "We find others with dormant bloodline potential and awaken them. We create a new generation of Daywalkers who will walk in sunlight and rule beside their vampire mates. We reshape this kingdom into something that can survive the coming centuries." "That sounds like a lot of work," Jane observed. Abraham's laugh was soft against her hair. "It will be. But I have been waiting 2,000 years for someone to share this burden. I can be patient for a few more decades while we build our empire." Jane turned in his arms, rising on her toes to kiss him properly. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, and realized it was true. Somewhere between the terror of her trial and the triumph of her victory, she had fallen completely for the ancient king who saw her worth when everyone else saw only a disposable human. "I love you," Abraham replied, his silver eyes blazing with emotion. "My queen, my mate, my miracle." They stood together on the balcony as night gradually surrendered to dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern mountains, Abraham retreated into shadow, while Jane stepped forward to greet the light. She spread her arms wide, tilting her face up toward the sun, and laughed with pure joy. She was Daywalker. She was queen. She was exactly where she belonged. Behind her, Abraham watched his blood-bonded mate embrace the sunlight, and for the first time in 2,000 years, he felt hope. Not just for himself, but for his entire people. Jane was the bridge they needed, the answer to questions they had stopped asking, the beginning of something unprecedented. "Your Majesty," a guard approached from the shadows, bowing low. "Lord Darius has been transferred to the blood mines as ordered. He requests one final audience with you before he begins his sentence." Abraham considered refusing. Darius had proven himself unworthy of mercy. But Jane touched his arm gently, and he saw compassion in her silver eyes. She had been hurt by Darius, humiliated and betrayed, nearly executed because of his ignorance. And still, she found room for forgiveness. "Bring him to the throne room," Abraham commanded. "But he speaks to both of us. Jane will hear his words and decide if they merit consideration." Darius entered the throne room in chains, his fine clothing replaced by the rough garments of a prisoner. He had aged somehow, the weight of his sentence already visible in the slump of his shoulders and the despair in his eyes. He fell to his knees before the twin thrones where Abraham and Jane now sat side by side. "Your Majesty, Your Grace," Darius whispered, his voice broken. "I beg forgiveness for my ignorance. I did not know what she was. I did not understand the mark. I failed in every way a vampire can fail." Jane studied the man who had once held her heart, who had whispered promises and made her believe she might belong in the vampire world. She felt nothing for him now except distant pity. "You failed me," she said quietly. "You found something rare and precious, and you tried to destroy it rather than admit you didn't understand what you had found. That speaks to your character more than any words of apology." Darius flinched, as if she had struck him. "I know. I deserve every moment of my sentence. But I wanted you to know that I did care for you, in my way. My feelings were not entirely false." "They weren't enough," Jane replied. "Your care, your affection, your desire, none of it was enough when it mattered most. You chose pride over truth, and you would have watched me burn to protect your reputation." "Yes," Darius bowed his head, "and I will live with that failure for the next 100 years." Abraham leaned forward slightly, his silver eyes cold. "You will live with it for eternity. Even after your sentence ends, you will remember the queen you nearly destroyed. You will watch her rule beside me, see the dynasty we build together, and know that you had the chance to be part of something extraordinary and threw it away." "I know," Darius whispered. "I know." Jane rose from her throne and descended the steps until she stood directly before Darius. She placed one hand on his bowed head, and he trembled beneath her touch. "I forgive you," she said softly. "Not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred for you would only poison what Abraham and I are building. But understand this. Forgiveness does not mean I ever want to see you again. When your sentence ends, you will leave this kingdom and never return. That is my mercy, and it is all you will receive." Darius looked up at her with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will never forget your kindness." "See that you don't," Jane replied. She returned to Abraham's side, and together they watched as guards escorted Darius from the throne room toward his century of labor in the blood mines. The doors closed behind him with a boom of finality. "You are more generous than I would have been," Abraham observed. "He was a lesson I needed to learn," Jane said, settling back into her throne. That claiming to care for someone and actually standing by them through difficulty are entirely different things. You have stood by me through every challenge. That means everything." Abraham took her hand and raised it to his lips. "And I will stand by you through every challenge yet to come. That is the promise of our blood bond, eternal partnership, eternal support, eternal love." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of political maneuvering and kingdom building. Jane learned the intricacies of vampire governance, attended court sessions where nobles brought disputes for resolution, and began the delicate process of searching for others who might carry dormant Daywalker blood. Abraham had ancient texts retrieved from the royal archives, documents that described the signs and markers of the bloodline. Together, they developed a plan to send emissaries throughout the kingdom and beyond, seeking humans who displayed unusual resilience, unexplained marks, or gifts that suggested something more than mortal heritage. The first candidate arrived 2 months after Jane's awakening. Her name was Maya, a young woman from the eastern provinces who had survived 3 vampire attacks that should have killed her. She bore no phoenix mark, but when Jane examined her, she sensed something familiar in the woman's blood. They tested her carefully, and when Maya drank from Abraham's wrist under controlled conditions, she transformed smoothly into the second Daywalker in 9 centuries. More candidates followed. Not all survived the awakening. The bloodline had thinned over generations, and some who carried traces of the gift lacked the strength to complete transformation. But those who survived joined Jane in creating something unprecedented. Within a year, there were 15 Daywalkers living in Abraham's castle, training together, learning to use their gifts. They could walk in sunlight, fight with preternatural strength, and serve as bridge between the vampire and human worlds. Jane discovered she was pregnant on the 2-year anniversary of her awakening. Abraham received the news with carefully controlled emotion, his silver eyes blazing with hope and wonder. The castle erupted in celebration. A Daywalker queen carrying a vampire king's child represented the fulfillment of every promise they had made. The baby, when she arrived 6 months later, was healthy and perfect, with her mother's silver eyes and her father's ancient power. They named her Aurora, for the dawn she would inherit. Aurora was the first of many children. Jane gave birth to 3 more over the following decades, each one stronger than the last, each one capable of walking in both sunlight and shadow. The other Daywalkers also bore children, creating a new generation of hybrids who would reshape vampire society from the foundation up. The kingdom transformed under Jane and Abraham's combined rule. They abolished the cruelest laws, established protections for humans who lived in vampire territory, and created a council where both species could negotiate disputes peacefully. Not everyone accepted the changes. There were rebellions, assassination attempts, entire bloodlines that chose exile rather than adaptation. But Jane and Abraham faced every challenge together, their blood bond making them unstoppable. On the 50-year anniversary of their bonding ceremony, Jane stood on the balcony overlooking the kingdom and marveled at how much had changed. The capital city now bustled with activity during daylight hours as Daywalkers conducted business in the sun. Human-vampire marriages were common, celebrated openly rather than hidden in shame. Children played in the streets without fear, protected by laws that valued all life. Abraham joined her on the balcony, his hand finding hers automatically after 5 decades of partnership. He looked exactly as he had the night they met, ageless, powerful, untouched by time. Jane had aged slightly, silver threads appearing in her dark hair and fine lines around her eyes. But her Daywalker blood kept her youthful far beyond mortal limits. She would live for centuries yet, maybe millennia, aging slowly alongside her eternal mate. "Do you regret it?" Abraham asked quietly. "The life you gave up to become this?" Jane thought of the timid library assistant she had been, the woman who believed Darius when he said she was special, the terrified prisoner kneeling in silver chains. That person felt like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. "No," she said honestly. "I regret the pain, the betrayal, the fear. But not the outcome. Never the outcome." "Good." Abraham pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "Because I am impossibly selfish, and I would have fought to keep you even if you had regrets." Jane laughed softly. "I know. That's why I love you." They stood together as the sun set and the stars emerged, king and queen of a kingdom that had learned to honor both darkness and light. Behind them, their children played in the castle halls, their laughter echoing through corridors that had known only solemnity for millennia. Ahead of them stretched centuries of life, partnership, and love that would reshape their world. Jane had entered the vampire court as a condemned human and emerged as a queen. She had drunk ancient blood and become the first Daywalker in 900 years. She had transformed not just herself, but an entire species, building bridges that would stand for generations. And she had found, in the most unlikely place imaginable, a love that would last forever. The phoenix mark on her collarbone glowed softly in the twilight, a reminder of the power that had always been hers. She had just needed someone to help her awaken it. Abraham pressed a kiss to the mark, and Jane felt their blood bond sing with connection and contentment. "Forever," Abraham whispered against her skin. "Forever," Jane agreed, and meant it with every fiber of her transformed being. They returned inside as full darkness fell, ready to face whatever challenges the night might bring. Together, they were unstoppable. Together, they were eternal. And together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. Did you like the story? Do you want a part 2? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, tell us which state you're watching from so I can give you a shout out in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe so you can stay updated on our next uploads. Thanks for watching!